So I'm just going to start with our introductions really quick, and our papers today will deal with three different topics with the North Vietnamese military strategy, which Dr. Gilbert will present on. Casey Scarpati will present on American books programs in Vietnam and in Vietnamese libraries during the Republic of Vietnam period, and Dr. Tuong will present on kind of social history of everyday life in North Vietnam. And I think with Professor Tuong we'll start with him. He's going to be our first presenter today. So I'll just give you a brief introduction. He is a professor of political science and a director of the U.S. Vietnam Research Center at the University of Oregon. He has held visiting appointments at Seoul University, Princeton University, and the National University of Singapore, and taught at the Naval Postgraduate School. His research has focused broadly on the comparative politics of state formation, development, and revolution in East and Southeast Asia, together with studies of Vietnamese nationalism, republicanism, and communism, and Vietnamese American history. He is the author or co-editor of 9 books, very prolific writer, and the most recent of which is Republic of Vietnam, 1963 to 1975, War, Society, and the Diaspora, which is an important contribution to our field, and also toward a framework for Vietnamese American studies. Please give Professor Tuong a warm welcome.
Good afternoon. Great to see all of you here. It's a pleasure being here today, and this is my topic. I want to talk about war and society, the effects of war on society in North Vietnam during the last 10 years of the war or so. I'm very interested in how the war, which means like U.S. bombing campaign over North Vietnam, and also North Vietnamese government mobilize soldiers and resources to send to the south for the war. So how that war affected the daily life of ordinary people in North Vietnam in the last 10 years of the war. And according to the propaganda, official propaganda, North Vietnamese were very, very enthusiastic about supporting their government to go to war. They believed that they were following a just cause for the revolution in South Vietnam, also the reunification of the country. So that's the official propaganda, right? But is that true? Were people really enthusiastic, or were they just following the order from the top? So that's kind of the question I'm interested in. And then, also want to know about the differences in the experience of various, groups of people, from urban people to rural people, from men to women, from, older people and younger people. And different people felt the war differently, right? So I want to find out as much as I could. The challenges are the shortage of reliable sources. So North Vietnam was, pretty much closed to outsiders during the war, unlike South Vietnam, which was open to, hundreds of foreign journalists who, go into every corner of the society to report. But North Vietnam was, mostly closed to Westerners, and they allow some of the anti-war activists to visit, but then they allowed them to see only what they wanted the activists to see, right? So the activists came home and wrote books and reports about lives in North Vietnam, but they turned out not to be very reliable. as many scholars like Pierre Asselin has pointed out, that the accounts were totally unreliable because North Vietnamese government only allowed them to see what they wanted to see, allowed them to craft a narrative that North Vietnam was the patriotic side in the war, and South Vietnam was simply a puppet to the U.S. So that's kind of the narrative that they wanted to create, and they invited the journalists, foreign journalists, in just to show that. So that's a challenge because the official propaganda is pervasive throughout, and the government of Vietnam today, even today, they have a clause in the criminal code that can imprison anyone accused of distorting history, meaning, saying something that's different from the official narrative about the war, about Ho Chi Minh, and so on. So they do have that law, and they can arrest you in Vietnam if you say something that they claim to be distorting history. So the party, the Vietnamese Communist Party, kind of jealously guard the narrative, the official narrative, which makes the job of finding reliable information about the war, about how life was in North Vietnam, about whether North Vietnamese citizens actually supported the war, make the job very difficult for researchers, right? So my research relies on a few sources that I was able to find over the years, and some of them came from North Vietnamese who grew up during the war, and I rely on their memoirs, I rely on the diaries. One of the diaries that I used was captured by US forces and returned to North Vietnam and republished as a book. I rely on newspapers at the time, I rely on archival documents, I rely on contemporary publications, and also the collection of party documents. I rely on a variety of sources to try to find out, like what were normal, ordinary North Vietnamese feeling at the time. And the focus was on these various policies by the government, the campaign to reform agricultural cooperatives, the campaign to recruit soldiers for the Tet Offensive. Just like about a year before the Tet Offensive, they launched a major campaign to recruit soldiers. And I want to follow up to see how people responded to that campaign. And then campaign to mobilize women to take over men's work, and then also campaigns to policies to try to suppress the black market in the cities, and also to cope with the rising social disorder in the last few years of the war. Before we go into the war years, we want to understand what happened in North Vietnam before the war, right before the war, meaning from 1954, when the communist government took over the whole of North Vietnam, until 1965, when the war became really intense, right? So during those 10 years, the Vietnamese Communist Party was able to launch a social revolution following the Maoist, Stalinist revolution in the Soviet Union and China, through various measures like land reform, or brutal land reform, which was a rural class struggle, organizational purge, control on urban residency, control of trade, industry, and agriculture. So the government, the party of North Vietnam destroyed the traditional social hierarchy and created a new hierarchy in its place. And in this hierarchy, the new hierarchy, the party leaders and the state bureaucrats occupy the top rung of the social hierarchy. And generally, like people who came from lower class backgrounds in the pre-colonial, in the colonial period, those people would rise to the top of the hierarchy, whereas people with, who came from higher classes in the old society were pushed to the bottom of the system. And the state maintained very strict control over political, economic, and cultural life. As a quote by Nguyễn Khải, who was a prominent writer in North Vietnam, he was telling Vương Chí Nhàn, who was another writer who wrote a diary of the war years, like daily writing on the war. So Nguyễn Khải was saying that our current society is like Russia under the Tsar. Russia at that time had a great surplus of military officials and bureaucrats. We also have a great surplus of cadres. There are so many cadres that they have become a heavy burden on society. So you could see how the state of North Vietnam already kind of expanded and reaching very deep into society, controlling society very, very tightly. And the fighting, just to report the fighting, I'm a political scientist, so we tend to report the fighting at the beginning. So if we talk too long, then you don't lose the, what we found. I found destructive effects. Obviously, war destroyed a lot of things. War destroyed lives. War destroyed property. War caused poverty and psychological distress. Other scholars have talked about the rallying effect, meaning, when a country is facing a foreign enemy, the people tend to rally around the government. And we see that also in Vietnam. According to other scholars, especially in the first few years of the war, as North Vietnam was facing US bombing. But I also found integrative effects, meaning when both state and society, when both government and the people face an external enemy, there's a tendency for both to cooperate more, to fight the external enemy. And that's what we call the integrative effects, meaning the state and society becomes closer to each other because both sides have an interest in joining forces to defend the country against the foreign powers. I also found liberating effects, which became strong over time because people were living under a relatively oppressive system in North Vietnam, as I showed. Lots of officials monitoring you, telling you what to do, sending people, from the urban cities to the countryside to live, and many South Vietnamese experienced that after the war in the form of new economic zones, the khu kinh tế mới, right? So the same thing happened in North Vietnam in the 50s, and so people were living under an oppressive regime, and when this regime was too busy fighting the war, what happened? People took advantage of it to try to, move around, try to do what the government normally would prohibit you, but then now it's kind of, too busy doing other stuff, fighting the Americans, fighting the South. You have a wiggle room to try to get out of that control. So that's kind of the liberating effects of the war that I found. And finally, especially in the last years, I found this integrative effects, meaning that the society of North Vietnam was kind of disintegrating. It was kind of becoming more chaotic. The government was losing control, and there were many cases of social disorder. According to many witnesses and also government accounts that Dr. Wade was generous to help me with. So first, let's start with the destructive effects. So Vương Chí Nhàn, the writer, he on his trip to Quảng Trị and back to Hanoi, he said, in this country, deaths have become normal. On my return to Hanoi, I have seen many mourning headbands and the swollen eyes of those who have lost their husbands and children. Hundreds, thousands, how many until it stopped? I would never get used to it. So war, obviously destroyed many lives. Trần Vàng Sao was a southern activist who was sent north. He was a member of the NLF, sent north for health reasons. And he became disappointed with the Northern society, and he wrote memoir after that. And he was telling the story of a family he met in North Vietnam. Tuong was the name of the woman. And she said, my husband was drafted, went south. His unit was in Tây Ninh the first few years. We still receive his letters, but no longer afterwards. I know the fighting is fierce over there, and he may have died. Do you know that every time when there is news that the commune office has received some death notices, those women whose husbands are in the south, like me, feel that we cannot concentrate our minds on life or work. We can't eat. We just hug each other and cry. So that was how a woman, farming woman in North Vietnam felt about her husband, and it's very sad. And what about her living conditions? How did her family live? And she continued to tell Trần Văn Sao that, Trần Văn Sao was telling this, that her family could have their stomachs filled, but did not enjoy food. Their daily meals include water spinach, grown in their family plots, with a dipping sauce made of sticky rice and corn. Occasionally they had fish, but it was only fragments of fish. Stew in the same sauce. Sometimes cut down a couple of bamboo trees and sold them at near market for 7 or 8 dong. Those times the family could enjoy eating fish. Besides salt, chili, and the dipping sauce, Tuong did not have anything else. No MSG, no sugar, no fish sauce. For lard, she must wait till Tết. Sugar was only provided in small quantities at Tết, and on National Day on September 2nd. So you could see how a normal family in the countryside were living at the time. So it just, rau muống, that's it, water spinach and the dipping sauce for most of the time, and just to fill their stomach, not to enjoy. So that was the destructive effects of war, right, on lives, on causing suffering to the people. Have 5 minutes. So integrative effects. So the party actually tried to reach out, tried to accommodate women, telling the cadres to open up the party organization to admit more women, to promote them to leadership position, because now almost all the men had left for the front, and we needed the woman to take over the job of the men. So I found this report by the writer Nguyễn Thành Long, published in 1968, under the name, the title Cái Gốc. So Nguyễn Thành Long was traveling around several rural communes and reported what he found. It's not fiction, right? It's what he saw. So this is what he wrote. A woman at the cooperative that he visited. A woman was the chair of the People's Committee, another was the first deputy, still another was the second deputy, still another was the head of the militia, and still another was the youth league's president. So it's all women, right? There was no man left. So the chairwoman of the commune, Phương, said, on the day 3 of us was elected as new leaders, the meeting had been adjourned, but we were still staying behind in shock. One of us suddenly broke out crying, "Oh my God, what do we do now?" Then 3 of us, a chairwoman and 2 deputies, all cried together as if we had never cried. That was it. That was to be the only time we cried. We're not so strong, but we were able to do things because we lean on each other, love our country, and our husbands. We're like a herd of buffaloes that form a circle and turn our horns outward when facing a ferocious predator in the forest, and we cry and so on. So I don't have time, but then, like the quote tell you about, how these women were taking over the man's job and what they felt. So this is an illustration from the article about Loan, the team leader of the local defense team, cleaning her gun. And she said that we live along the coast. Besides fish, there are only potatoes to eat. There's not much rice. I still remember the day we saw the men off to the front. They said, we want to eat rice, not potatoes, so we are going to the front to fight the Americans. We also think the same way when we fight the Americans. So this is a village along the coastal areas, and they would not, they could not grow much rice given the soil. So they have to eat potatoes all the time. But then the article was so truthful that the party leader came out criticizing it as publicly as an erroneous story, deviant story. And the criticism said in the essay, women appear clueless and tired in labor, confused and disorganized at war, nervous and immature at the helm of local government. Under his pen, everyday life in the North appears gloomy, far from the jealously fighting and working environment we now have. So the party, kind of cracked down on this report because it was, too truthful. So the secret to North Vietnam's effective mobilization, which was, stood at the rate of 74% of all males of the raft age. And then about 1 million soldiers were killed in the battle. So the root, I argue, the secret of this effective mobilization was the use of rural cooperatives as a part of the war machine. So the local draft boards work closely with the rural cooperative leadership manager to keep track of, which family has how many young men and who of them are in the raft age. And because they have to report their labor to the cooperative for work and for food, then the rural cooperative have information about, like which man, how many men are available for the draft in the village. And so there's no way anyone can try to avoid the draft. 1 minute left, okay. So this quote came from Winston Tweed, and he said, I had no other choice to go. Other young men also thought like me, you either had to find a way to avoid the draft, I had to go because it was required. Not like in the propaganda that, like young men were enlisted en masse. Nguyễn Văn Thạc, who died as a martyr in South Vietnam 1972, leaving behind a diary that was captured. He admitted in his diary that he was forced to go, he had to go. If I had not enlisted, I would be accused of opposing government policy, opposing the party. So this came from a young man, a university student. And there are many others. And it's kind of funny because people try to mock the party. These are the list of the 3 top awards honor for military families. The term in Vietnamese were changed, were parody to make fun of the policy. So bạn gia đình vẻ vang, glorious family role. If you have 1 or 2 sons in military service, was the term became bạn gia đình vắng vẻ, meaning lonely family role, and so on. Like the examples like that. There was rising social inequality in North Vietnam, as you see from these quotes. So people accuse leaders such as Hanoi Mayor Trần Duy Hưng, saying that they were enjoying safety under their well-constructed bomb shelters, oblivious to the suffering of ordinary people. So the leaders were, living under heavily constructed, very expensive bomb shelters, whereas, like ordinary people, obviously, were vulnerable to bombing. And the second quote, Vương Trí Nhàn also reported that I can't figure out if the leaders even know that we have no tires for our bikes, no toothpaste to brush our teeth. it seems they cannot know. So there's a huge gap between the leaders. Okay, try to stop in 1 minute. New ruling class in the countryside, like the rural cooperatives became very corrupt class. The black markets emerged in the cities and became thriving. This last data is very interesting. Many government vehicles were stolen and then used to steal raw materials from government warehouses. 17 vehicles were stolen in the Hai Ba Trung district of Hanoi alone in the first 9 months of 1967. So the government was too busy and people had the chance to get out, to engage in the black market and stealing government property and so on. The last few years, Hanoi became chaotic and there were riots by veterans in Ninh Bình. And the party leader had to admit and then order the strengthening of control because they were losing control over society. So total, these are just kind of to summarize the facts of the war. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Tuong. So our next presenter is going to be Dr. Mark Jason Gilbert, who is a professor emeritus at Hawaii Pacific University, where he served as an endowed chair in world history from 2006 to 2019. He also holds the professor emeritus status at the University of North Georgia, where he taught from 1981 to 2006. He attended UCLA for his doctorate program and has gone on to have a long and prolific career where he has written a wide variety of publications, both on the Vietnam War and world history. Thank you. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, this paper is only 7 pages long, so I think I can keep to time. So don't get angry if I'm 1 minute over.
I won't.
Because I'm keeping it very short. The first part of the paper looks at how mental constructs confused both North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, and the United States about the Tet Offensive. We spent the last 50 years trying to understand it, and we're getting close, but that's half the paper. What this paper is about from the Tet Offensive to the end of the war, and then till 1986. Same problem. How do you look at the way people formulate both illusion and reality, and why illusion almost always wins? And I used to think it's hard to understand that. But right now in American politics, it really does look like illusion can win. And of course, it has happened in other societies. And I say this because when I'm reading this, I'm going to give a lot of credit to communist ideology, because that illusion won their war. So in other words, you can be a madman, or your ideology could be evil, but you can withstand what that last presentation was, and you have the confidence that you can do it. Now, of course, a Vietnamese spoke to me today and said, well, the difference between the communists and the non-communists says that the communists will kill you, and will kill all of you. Well, there's a saying should be saying about war, but you get it from Tolstoy. All happy families are happy in the same way, and unhappy families are all unhappy in their own way. And that's true of all wars. I was thinking, of course, The Best Years of Our Lives, a film about what the war was like to have survived it, World War II. There's also a film called When the 10th Month Comes, which is an amazing film, which has to do with the Cambodian invasion and how people were living through that, and how veterans tried to explain why that happened and why it killed this woman's husband. And so almost makes fun of the Communist Party, actually, in Vietnam, that particular film. How do you explain the invasion of Cambodia? America thought the invasion of Cambodia was all about what? Vietnamese imperialism. Tony Lake, the person responsible for that, amongst others, committed the United States to support the Khmer Rouge, saying that the Khmer Rouge will be better, that people will be, the Cambodians will be happier than if the Vietnamese invade them. So, these are all constructs. We believe in them, and it leads us down pathways. So as I say things that you might not agree with or may not like, when you ask questions, I'll say, no, no, no. You understand this when I can explain it to you. So here we go. Otherwise, it looks perfectly simple to me. But as I read over it, I go, okay, let's see what happens. I'm going to read it. I never read paper, but it's only 7 pages, so, okay. Much has been written. Can you hear me, by the way? I feel like Ho Chi Minh. Can you hear me in September 1945? Much has been written on the general uprising, the general offensive of 1968, to achieve a mass rising against the Republic of Vietnam and its allies. Much has also been said about the failure to achieve this, its main objective. But less is written about another objective that was achieved, the breaking of the will of the Republic of Vietnam's American allies. Because many within the US, including contemporary Central CIA analysis, regarded this result as a mere political victory, and you heard from our last panel that the Tet Offensive was a political victory. It wasn't a military victory. I don't know any military historian who would separate those two things, but illusions, and from a very brilliant person who said it. A mere political achievement, but as a result of that, sufficient attention has not initially been paid to the changing nature of the course of the Politburo of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam strategic thinking before and after Tet. Only recently have the origins of the Tet Offensive been correctly traced to the resolution of bitter factional infighting within the Politburo, but sufficient attention has yet to been paid to how the Tet Offensive's failure to achieve the mass rising forced the Politburo to revisit the resolution of the ideological divide that lay behind the launching of the General Offensive. The General Offensive was a belief that the revolution needed to succeed, and the left wing of the party argued that this could be achieved. And the Stalinist side of the party, Vodenzak, amongst others, thought this was a big mistake. Post-Tet Politburo thinking is thus generally less understood than it might be, with the result that many scholars have since failed to fully understand not only the Politburo's post-Tet military strategy from 1969 to 1975, but Vietnam's domestic policy since independence. So, Hanoi, a return to consensus. So, where are we thus far? There was a left and right wing in the Politburo, the extreme revolutionaries, the Mao revolutionaries, ran the Tet Offensive. It was their idea. It failed. Are they going to admit it's a failure and bring in the right wing or pendulum over to that point? And I would argue what happens in this paper is eventually what happens in almost all Vietnamese history. Eventually, pragmatism prevails, both against the extreme right and the extreme left, which is a lesson to us, because the Vietnamese seem to be well able to make these kinds of ideological compromises, despite their seeming rigidity, whereas we, as we know today, aren't so lucky recently. Okay, so here we go. In the spring of 1969, Hanoi realized that the continued main force engagement with U.S. government of Vietnam forces of the kind associated with the 3 iterations of the Tet Offensive in 1968 was not only costly, but no longer appropriate. This is evidence of 2 speeches serialized in Nanzan and also on the broadcast by Radio Hanoi in December of 1969. It also reflected a piece of major policy writing on the party's military line, which appeared in a paper written under the name of Senior General Von Zop. Zop described the party's military line of the future as pursuing not a complete departure of the previous People's War with 3 progressive stages, guerrilla war, mobile war, and strategic counteroffensive, but following a less mechanical adoption of modes of warfare tailored to, quote, the characteristics and developing trends at the moment. He wrote that with the de-Americanization of the war, Vietnamization, and the start of the Paris peace talks, the defeat of the United States imperialists was inevitable. What was now needed was for the revolutionary forces in the South to redirect their energies to supporting the negotiations by reducing the military and political effectiveness of the government of Vietnam. In effect, this took the form of protracted war principles to a new level, and these are all direct quotes, to a new level in new historical conditions of armed force within a political force. This meant carrying out small attacks and medium attacks and big attacks whenever there could be creatively employed to engage the enemy comprehensively by both armed and political struggle with a view to economize strategy and here we go. Yeah, fine. And this was actually reflected in Phu Yen province in April of 1970. So a few months of that declaration, there was a change in Phu Yen. Let's see, it's Robert J. Thompson has written a book about that, which was called Clear, Hold, and Destroy. I had already come to that conclusion, and he was very happy when I gave a paper. He said, I'm writing a book about this. And I said, I'm very happy you are writing a book about that, because real academics don't mind being trod on, as long as they're actually not stealing from each other. The effect of this shift in operations came to be regarded with grave concern by American forces due to their intended role as an antidote to post-Tet U.S. GVN pacification programs. Particularly, it was recognized as our current policy in pacification. This new policy of more flexible strategy and more political operations like assassination would continue in the event of a ceasefire associated with the negotiated settlement of the war. Okay, the North Vietnamese and their allies in the South were shifting to essentially more assassinations, more political activities, as was warranted at the moment, because attacking U.S. troops now made no sense. The target now was the government of Vietnam's military forces and their pacification operations. But we'll get more into that as we go along. Hanoi's emphasis on opportunistic strikes, highly mobile, flexible, small unit operations, kidnapping, with an accelerated program of assassinating effective government of Vietnam personnel, again in April of 1970, acted directly to understand the sense of public security in the South that American advisors and numerous U.S. public opinion polling efforts identified as the primary determinant of the political loyalties of Southerners. In other words, in Vietnam, polling was showing that what really mattered to the Vietnamese was their political security, their physical security. Tet had undermined that dramatically. And the reports of Brand Corporation also were noting that while people were relieved that the Tet offensive failed, they didn't think if it ever happened again, that standing alone, the Republic of Vietnam could defeat it. So that was very firm in both RAND reports and also Just POW interviews province by province. So it's quite interesting that in country, people were thinking, people in the South are not as secure as we think they are. All right. U.S. authorities observed that a key element of this strategy was the employment of enemy psychological warfare techniques that compelled villagers to choose between the promises of the cadre regarding post-war opportunities and those of the government of Vietnam, which could not shake its reputation for corruption despite its, sometimes successful, reform efforts. In March of '69, American polling suggested that only 1 in 10 of the government of Vietnam's citizens believed its political parties reflected the chief aspirations of its people. At Cos Vinh, propaganda was developed to exploit the growing public awareness that despite the increasing efficiency of ARVN, the goals of Vietnamization would not reach fruition before the end of the Paris peace talks. So in other words, regardless of what improvements are happening in the South, it wouldn't happen in time before the war was going to come to an end in their vision, because the negotiations will lead to a North Vietnamese victory. They believed that increasing numbers of the most loyal of Saigon's elite believed that the talks would not lead to a settlement in favor of the government of Vietnam. These are polling of loyal South Vietnamese citizens. And their elite, particularly in Saigon, did not really think that it was possible for the Republic to stand if the Americans were part of the negotiated settlement. However, more important was that increasing indoctrination of its operatives in new revolutionary ethics would enable them to, as the North Vietnamese, to effectively draw all others towards unifying the homeland. Let's end the war, let's unify the country. Now, to most American eyes, their own, America and the government of Vietnam, campaigns to counter such enemy action were quite successful. American advisory personnel pointed to the declines in contact with enemy forces, increasing safety in their districts, and other signs of progress. But others in the same position of being analyzed and polled said that these were good on a map, but illusory. A point driven home by an analysis written by Mr. Lam. That's all it says on the document in MapView. And I'm going to read it to you, and 99% of these words are his. Lam was a multilingual, well-educated, fiercely anti-communist Vietnamese, a former Hanoi resident, where he was arrested by the communists in 1945. In July of 1971, he was working in a Chu Hoi center in Military Region 3. There, he daily encountered soldiers, increasingly from the north, driven to rally or defect to the government of Vietnam by B-52 airstrikes and artillery. His analysis noted how those that remained in the field were deeply indoctrinated by formidable political officers and commanded and controlled by fanatical commanders and skilled political cadre. They have iron discipline that enable them to excel in small unit warfare and able to promote a world vision that was superior to that offered by leaders of the government of Vietnam, who, quote, sent poor men to die. He judged that the recruitment by the VC had been slowed by the violence of the Tet Offensive, but the VC will never stop fighting. And such was the appeal of their propaganda and heroic manner in which the VC presented themselves in the villages, identifying with the people and not eating their ducks. They presented as so great a contrast, and this is the most important part of the paper here, they presented so great a contrast with the conduct of the war raised by the GMV authorities, which he exemplified in great detail, that he believed that the American withdrawal, the American withdrawal that he expected eventually, even if American aid continued, would follow the same pattern as the failure of that of Chiang Kai-shek's regime in China, where US aid was sent to support his struggle with Mao Zedong, a lesson that was well known by the Vietnamese people. He expected, on the basis of past performance, with the American withdrawal, Vietnamese people would find that every former American base, from trucks to illumination shells, as well as gas, would be robbed, and even gunpowder would be stolen on the sly and sold to firecracker manufacturers. He wrote that he was not a defeatist, but he advised his superiors that true patriots believe that things will not get better in this country. It needs to be undertaken by sponsorship of the United Nations Organization, or CETO, or some European or other Asian powers. This was actually circulated through NATV, and I found it interesting that it was preserved. What's the significance of this? There were people in the American and government of the Republic of Vietnam who saw things getting better. There were people who were Vietnamese and Americans who didn't really think that a negotiated settlement would actually be sufficient to provide for the survival of the Republic of Vietnam. And what was at the heart of that particular difference was this understanding that something was happening strategically different in the Politburo's strategy, a flexible strategy of political assassinations, etc., and also military operations, which is why we never saw the Easter Offensive happen. Because we, once again, like before the Tet Offensive, were wiping out the enemy. The contact with Viet Cong and PAVN was shrinking. And then all of a sudden, there's a major offensive from the north. And unfortunately, because other people have said differently, there was huge victory for the north at the end of the 72 offensive. It failed as an offensive, just as the Tet Offensive did. But the Central Highlands were totally lost to the South Vietnamese government. And that was, of course, part of its undoing later on. So, last thing, did people in the north recognize this? That this is what they had achieved? And the answer was yes. And that's why they were willing to keep fighting against, that's perfect. Keep fighting while negotiating, which we now find out pissed off Nixon and his advisors and led to the Christmas bombing. In actual fact, the North Vietnamese had already presented, as we know, a negotiated settlement which the North was willing to accept. 2 more years, and we will take over, we will win. But the United States didn't like their attitude. And the result was the Christmas bombing took place. So, in conclusion, it took maybe 1 minute. Right? Post-1975, Lê Duan, along with Lê Duc Tho and others who championed the maximum revolutionary approach in 1968, though humbled by the cost of the Tet Offensive, were flushed with victory over the world's leading capitalist nation, which they viewed as the ultimate justification for and validation of their revolutionary ideology. Accordingly, they pushed aside the rightists and pursued a maximal revolutionary post-war domestic agenda. However, in the 1980s, when the Vietnamese found mounting evidence of the difficulties attendant on an overly doctrinal approach to prevailing condition, it was again sufficiently flexible in its interplay of ideologies that and international conditions, tactile situation, and strategic conditions that determined Politburo's policy. And what was it in 1986? Doi Moi. And I know very few, I know too many people who don't understand that this is the result of a revolutionary party with an impossible task that convinced itself that it was going to win by timing their strategy and policy. Despite all the mistakes that they made, they would win. And they did. And we don't like the outlaw. I assume everyone here knows an agent of the government. So what we can say simply is they won. And they won because they were smart and because they were Vietnamese. All of them were. And if you look at Nguyen Cao Ky and things that he said after the war, you understand he had an understanding of this too. But you're looking at a post-colonial state in Vietnam during the American War, where you're looking at a successful Mao movement in the north. The price, of course, of this for everyone was enormous because everyone is happy in war. Anyway, thank you very much.
All right, for our third and final presenter today, I will introduce Casey Scarpati, who is a California native, just like myself, and attended UCLA for his bachelor's degree before completing his master's in history from our very own Texas Tech University here, which he graduated with his MA degree in 2016 after working with Dr. Milam. And he is currently a student at UMass Amherst, working with Professor Christian Appy. He will defend his dissertation, Waging War by the Book, American Libraries and Texts in Vietnam, 1946 to 1975, at the end of this month. I'm sure that'll be a big weight off your shoulders. After graduation, he plans to earn his teaching credential with a short-term goal of teaching high school AP history during the academic years and community colleges during the summers, and the long-term goal of being a teacher at the community college full-time. Casey?
Yeah, good one.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for being listening to my presentation. So yes, I defend the dissertation on April 30th, so at the end of this month. So a couple pictures up here that I'll explain in a little bit of detail. This summer, I went to Vietnam and I'm looking at bookstores. I'm traveling to Book Street in Ho Chi Minh City, and I'm not really sure what I'll find. I've been writing about these libraries for 8 years at UMass, for the better part of like 3 years as a student at Texas Tech. And so I get to one of these bookstores and I find a book called The Big Change, which apparently was one of the books that the United States transported to a lot of its libraries in other countries around the world at the time. So I see that one, I'm on my hands and knees, I'm looking at this section of books called American Antiques. These books are expensive. I'm spending $15 or $20 on these books. But here, the book I'm holding up in this lower left-hand corner, you can't see the title of it. It's called Doi Hao. It means sociology. It's an American textbook that had been translated into Vietnamese. The title in the top right corner, that's Kinh Tế Học. That is economics. This is a textbook by Paul Samuelson. So I had already written in my dissertation about 3 pages about that textbook by Paul Samuelson, the process of translating this into Vietnamese. The United States thought, oh, this will be a 300, 400 page book, 250 to 300 words on a page. It turned into over 800 pages and far more words per page. So again, I have both these books, I bought them, I did not bring them here. So what got me started on thinking about these libraries that we have in Vietnam and other countries around the world during the Cold War, I found something at Texas Tech's Vietnam Archive as a master's student, just a simple book list. I see titles, I see works by like Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, our economic ideas and values. And I don't quite know what I have at the time, but I can feel the wheels spinning in my head that I can do something with these book lists. There's something about this cultural turn in studying the American War in Vietnam. And so I just included a couple of these book lists. This one on the right is from 1964. It's a list of texts that we sent to Vietnam to promote this idea of Chinese aggression. So the list on the left, this is a list of countries. This is from 1974. So after the United States soldiers are out of Vietnam, we're still sending books there in 1974. Okay, some of my focuses are, was the United States able to replace France in Vietnam? Militarily, yes. Culturally, not so much. Were these sites accepted by Vietnamese and Americans? And for this, I look at Mary Louise Pratt's theory of a contact zone. The idea that as a culture moves from one place to another, it is remade. You might think, if you've been to a McDonald's in another country, if you go to a McDonald's in Vietnam, you might see shrimp burgers. If you go to a McDonald's in China, it might look different than a McDonald's in the United States. So really just the idea being it's a McDonald's, but that local population is going to influence what that McDonald's looks like. the same thing is going to be true of these American libraries that we have. And I talk about these American libraries, I call it the American Book Program. It's a combination of a propaganda agency called the United States Information Agency that was created in the early 1950s, and the Asia Foundation. Not a ton has been written about the Asia Foundation, so the fact that we can see the Asia Foundation engaging in book diplomacy in Vietnam from the 50s, the 60s, into the 70s, I thought was pretty interesting. And I conclude with, was it ever possible? These libraries the texts are 90% in English, and so those ones that I just showed you, the sociology, the economics textbook, those were rare examples of books that had actually been translated into Vietnamese. So was it ever possible when 90% of the books are in English? We'll find out. Okay, so tracking this book program over time, again, it's a combination of the USIA, United States Information Agency, and the Asia Foundation. So my first quote is from the Committee for Free Asia, which that will become the Asia Foundation. If Vietnam is to emerge as a healthy state, it will have to develop a social and education doctrine so as to reconcile the ancient traditions and the new conditions of the present-day world. There is need for a better supply of books and pamphlets and reading material for the population now being made literate. That's from the Committee for Free Asia in 1953. The next quote is from the American ambassador, Elbridge Dubrow, in 1957. He's talking about another library we had called the Vietnamese American Associations. And he says the teaching of English language to large groups of Vietnamese military personnel and civilians will provide a firmer basis for mutual understanding in the years to come. I found in my research, my propaganda agency, the United States Information Agency, they did readership surveys, and you see in 1969 that Vietnamese still preferred reading in French, not in English. So just seeing that as a sign that this promotion of English language training, it's not being absorbed. Also around that time, the percent of Vietnamese college students that finished a book was like 60%, but the Vietnamese that visited these libraries, the percent that checked out a book and finished it, if they did not have a college degree, was only 5%. Okay. The last quote is from the director of the United States Information Agency in 1965. I thought this was a pretty illuminating one because it's kind of spilling the game. We say we're building these libraries initially out of altruism. They're symbols of American exceptionalism. And so this quote here, our libraries are neither a recreational reading oasis nor a scholarly research center. The USIS library exists for a special purpose, to promote US objectives. So let me get into that a little bit. What were the United States objectives? So our USIA, the local branches were called USIS, our USIS Saigon, which was created in 1946. It justified its existence by saying we need to counter Japanese World War II propaganda that's been set against us. Well, what was one of the things Japanese World War II propaganda said? It said the Americans are imperialists. So what better way to say that we're not imperialists than opening a propaganda agency in Vietnam in 1946? Just a little bit ironic. Okay, some quotes. So here's one from 1946. I got this from Texas Tech Vietnam Center and Archive. Special Information Policy Plan Number 1, an internal draft written by USIS Saigon, noted that building American libraries in Southeast Asian countries, including Vietnam, fit into the agency's bigger goal of providing a bulwark against the further spread of communism in Southeast Asia. So after we decided, okay, we need to counter Japanese anti-American propaganda, then we say we need these libraries to be anti-communist. Then after that, we move the goalpost a little bit and say, we need these libraries to promote modernization theory. Modernization theory being the idea that social, political, and economic factors of a country all need to be promoted. It's a part of nation building. After we're done with modernization theory, we start trying to find texts like that Chinese communist book list I showed you earlier. We try to find texts that are more suitable, something that Vietnamese could more appreciate, that's more connected to a history that they would be interested in. This last quote is from Ambassador Maxwell Taylor in 1965. He's standing outside the USIS Saigon Library as it's being opened. And he says, this library, I think, symbolizes that other side of the American effort. The books that we have in this library suggest the fact that America is indeed interested in fighting with books as well as with bullets. So for a long time, and by long time I mean from 1946 to 1969, 1970, these libraries think that they're able to influence the war, yet remain separate from the war at the same time. Okay, criticism to these libraries. I thought this was a pretty interesting part right here. So we know by 68, 69, after the Tet Offensive, many Americans begin opposing the war. Something I found interesting is by 66, an examination of these libraries shows the article on the right, this newspaper entry, it's New York Times, R.W. Apple Jr. He's written 500 articles about Vietnam, 500 newspaper entries, excuse me. But he talks about it, I mean, the headline says it all. Saigon, USIA hides critical books. So you could go into one of these libraries and you walk around and you might be like, where's the Bernard Fall text? One of the prominent experts who's not as ideological as somebody like maybe Jay Mollin, somebody who's a little more ideological. You might be like, where's Robert Chaplin's text? Where's Howard Zinn's text? So this article, this newspaper entry on the right, it exposes the idea that these libraries, the United States casts them as sites of American exceptionalism, but they're actually quite restrictive. You have to go into a hidden section of these libraries to be able to access some of the texts that are actually questioning of American policy. The one on the left, this is I.F. Stone's weekly, same year, 1966. In this one, it's a little blurry, but he's basically making the argument that our book program is being subsidized by our United States Information Agency. Our propaganda agency is paying publishers to push books. Prager gets a lot of money for this. So again, just the idea, like, we don't think maybe libraries being subsidized by a propaganda agency. We might walk into a library and see it as an act of altruism, that this building's here, the free flow of information. But an examination of these books, and when I would encounter a book list, I would look for reviews. I would read the books, parts of the books, and then I would look for reviews. Some of the books are just so outright propagandistic. You'll have like a professor writing a review of some of these texts and just saying like, this is literally propaganda. Like this text is propaganda designed to further American aims in the Cold War. So what's Vietnamese resistance to these sites look like? Well, I got a picture on the next page, but I'll get to that in a second. So on November 10th, 1968, second-year law student at Canto University, we had USIS libraries in Saigon, in Hue, in Canto, and he's a student chairman for the council. His name's Win Van Keo. He gave the opening speech at a seminar titled "The Americans and the Sovereignty of Vietnam." In his speech, Keo called for a ceasefire, critiqued America's unilateral interventions in the country, and demanded that South Vietnam remain untethered from the United States in peace talks. This next one, James Bullington, in this quote, was 25 years old. He's at Hue in May of 1966 at the USIS Center there. So he's in charge, and if you know what happens in May and Hue in 1966, there's going to be a big protest there, and the library is going to be attacked. Books are going to be burnt. That center is going to be burnt down. And so James Bullington, a 25-year-old, he's racing back to the center in his car, and he can sense that something bad is happening. There's a lot of angry protesters surrounding his car. He says, it was not pro-communist, although the political turmoil it created was harmful to the government's ability to prosecute the war. And then the last quote from Vietnamese musician Pham Duy in 2013. He also performed outside of the USIS Saigon grand opening in 1965 that Maxwell Taylor was at. We never believed that the Americans would abandon us. We could not conceive of it. I think you misunderstood us, and we misunderstood the free world, the Vietnamese. We did. We did not see the war in Vietnam like a game between the great powers. Okay, so just an image of USIS Way burning down. Police did not stop this. So again, I think another useful thing of looking at these libraries is they're barometers for public opinion. You can kind of see tensions here. You can gauge how Vietnamese feel about American presence. When USIS Way was burnt down, somebody told James Bullington, a monk told him, like, we basically knew, like, this site, if we protest at this site, if we attack this site, like, that's a way to get your attention that's less overt than, like, military conflict. Okay. One of the interesting things I found too was a lot of authors who had, in the 50s and 60s, supported the American book program, who had supported lending their books, their voices to these USIS libraries in Vietnam. They begin to turn against the war. And so this is Alfred de Grazia. He writes a political science economic text. So basically, we have a big political science economic text, de Grazia. We have a sociology text, we have an economic text. These were all translated into Vietnamese. So de Grazia, if you read this, it's a little long, but basically he's making the point of we can try and give aid, but like if our aid, it's not really appropriate or sensitive to Vietnamese needs, yet we're giving it anyways. You know, maybe think of the commodity import program and how that caused a lot of inflation in Vietnam. And think of how this suggests American exceptionalism, United States thinking that it knows what's best. Paul Samuelson, the economics textbook writer, in 1970, he gave a speech. He won the Nobel Prize. He's a Harvard economist. He is teaching for 7 decades. He gave an address for his Nobel Prize speech where he critiques the military-industrial complex. Another author, Bernard Malamud, who earlier in the 60s wrote a book for the United States Information Agency. By the late 60s, he writes something called My Son the Murderer. That's a short story about a young man who's looking at the TV and is just incredibly jaded and just feels an incredible sense of detachment from society, from what America is doing in Vietnam, and his parents can't really understand him. Henry Steele Commager wrote, he helped organize a book list sent to the library in Vietnam, and he turned against the war later too. So thinking of the myths exposed, so I kind of gave you like a big overview of my dissertation. The paper that I turned in for the presentation, it was based on my 6th and final chapter, where I focus on the idea. I build up the case that like these are what these libraries are doing. In my last chapter, I take a look back and I say that were we successful here? Were these libraries effective? And the answer is a big no. So this myth, the United States had replaced France in Vietnam by the early 1960s. Not quite. As I said earlier, there was still a preference. Even though the libraries had fewer French books than English titles, the French titles circulated at far higher rates. Vietnamese preferred the French titles over the English titles. The idea that we had these Vietnamese American Association libraries, and they were somehow thought of as less ideological, as a more honest collaboration than USIS libraries. The VAA libraries, they merge with the United States Information Service libraries, and that removes any veneer that they were separate, that they were not pushing propaganda. So, yeah, the 2B, VAAs, including their boards of leadership, they would have one more Vietnamese person than American on their boards to give the illusion that they were sites of cultural collaboration. These VAAs, including their boards, were fronts for American objectives in South Vietnam, precisely the creation of a stable South Vietnamese society and or incorporation into the Western free world. Okay, and the last myth where these libraries effective. Well, many Vietnamese, in July 1969, the USIS released the Saigon Book and Media Survey showing that South Vietnamese greatly preferred television and radio programs over books. That statistic I already mentioned. So again, is it ever possible? I argue that to think that these libraries could remain separate from a war effort in another country, in Vietnam, that's kind of foolish. Already in the 1950s, there's a grenade found in one of these libraries. You're behind a book. USIS Way is burnt down. These libraries, there's protests outside of them. 90% of the books are in English at these libraries. There's not a lot of collaboration with the Vietnamese for what books to put in these libraries. So was it ever possible? No. But did that stop the United States from building these libraries in places like Vietnam? And by the way, we had over 200 of these libraries throughout the world during the Cold War. That doesn't stop the United States from building them. So what can these books tell us about US-Vietnam relations today? Well, I wonder, when I traveled to Vietnam, how do these bookstores acquire these texts? How does the government and bookstore owners view these texts? So again, I paid like $15 or $20 for some of these individual texts. So I wonder, like, as these bookstores, as they sell them to Americans, are they promoting certain themes of these texts? Are they holding some and because maybe they view them as less profitable? So is there any kind of like screening for which books to promote? So yeah, that's everything. So thank you, everybody.
All right, everyone. Thank you, the three of you, for your papers and your formative talks. So due to, I think, as you can see from the three papers that were presented, there are three individual papers, and they each have kind of distinct topics in their own right, from military strategy at the high level to soft power cultural diplomacy, and looking at North Vietnamese society during wartime. So I could stand up here and try to build some theme between these three papers, but I'm not going to try to do that. I think that you would probably enjoy asking questions to our three panelists here more than you know, hearing me try to force that. So, and also in the interest of time, I think we just open it up to questions. And I have a couple prepared too, if you know, but I'll let the audience go first. And I'd also one note is also try to keep the questions to a minute or so, and make sure they're questions and not statements. So, yeah, please.
Professor Ngu, this might be outside the scope of what you studied, but I have two questions actually. So, I was wondering if you found similar things within the Republic of Vietnam in terms of, I know there were young people in Vietnam, 17, 18, when they lowered the conscription age for the Republic of Vietnam down to 17, they were angry. I remember their protests, but I'm wondering if you found the same kind of like disillusionment or not wanting to be conscripted in South Vietnam, the Republic of South Vietnam. And then my second question is to Casey. Maybe I got your names wrong. The library. There were massive book burnings starting May 15th. 1975, and so I'm wondering if the books that you're finding now are books that have been saved as a result of that, and if you kind of studied or looked into those book burnings, you know, as a continuation of your looking at the library. So those are my two questions.
Well, thanks for the question. In South Vietnam, you know, like there were many young men who did not want to be drafted, you know, and that kind of, you know, a fact in any society at war. There were, you know, young men who didn't want to go to war. Maybe they didn't like to sacrifice their life because of, you know, they didn't believe in the cause, or maybe they didn't want to submit themselves to the harsh discipline, you know, of a military life. Or they didn't want to be far away from their loved ones, and so there could be many reasons why young men don't want to join the military, and that's why there's the draft, right? The draft meaning, like if you are at that age, you're forced to, you kind of forced to join the military. So, and we know a lot about draft dodging in South Vietnam, but we just know nothing about North Vietnam. That's the thing, right? So that and what we know from official propaganda is that like young men were really enthusiastic and they were just joining the military. They volunteer. They use their blood to write letters and so on. So there's a lot of that. But then we don't know whether that's true or not, right? So my paper is just trying to find out whether that's true in North Vietnam, but certainly in South Vietnam that was not. That was we know a lot more.
Yeah, so for my paper, I'm looking at 46 to 1975. So thinking for a future study, examining 1975 in more detail, but absolutely, these books were the ones in the libraries, the books I was finding. I'm opening up the pages and I'm seeing stamps that say Asia Foundation, which transported books to these libraries. I'm seeing Frederick Lewis Allen's The Big Change was the most common book sent to these libraries. Those 3 textbooks that I pulled up, those were in these Vietnamese libraries. So absolutely, these books that I was finding in Vietnam on Book Street and in Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, those were the books in the libraries, and why I was getting down on my hands and knees and like staring at these books, and the workers there were like, why is he so fixated on these? So yeah, absolutely, they were those books.
Yeah, hello, my name is Jan Slovak and I came from Poland, and I have actually a question for Professor Tuong, but I guess it also ties a bit about what Professor Mark said about the delusions and dreams that actually people convince themselves to believe in. Because from Polish files, I know that in 1965 there was this kind of thinking in the north, because 2 Polish journalists actually went to the north just after the first round of the bombing of the north. That people in the north, and it was not actually the official propaganda, but they believed that every problem in the north will be kind of dispersed when they will liberate, of course, the south. So there's not enough rice, but it's not a problem, because when we get to the south, there is this, this rice bowl. There are problems in the industry, but it's not a problem because south is very rich, and so on and so on. And my question is this delusion? Because there was also a thing that everyone believed that 1965 is the year. They couldn't provide the exact date, but every person that those journalists had a conversation with was completely convinced that 1965 would be the year of the unification. And my question is if there is still a trace of this belief that liberating or bringing South to the communist rule will, all problems will be gone, because the South will somehow solve those problems.
Well, thanks for that question. I couldn't find anything that suggested what you said, which is that people was hoping that the problems in the north would be solved if once they took over the south. Maybe it could have been framed in a different way. Maybe like, okay, we are suffering now a lot, but then hopefully, once the country is unified, things will get better, right? So that's what, Ho Chi Minh promised them too, right? So like, we're gonna sacrifice a lot now, but later on, but that doesn't quite, kind of create an illusion, like you said. But it was an illusion by itself, right? So because, we know after the war that people actually suffered more, right? So it was a different kind of illusion, but it's not the kind of illusion that you mentioned.
Thank you for that comment. Peace, land, and bread. When you have a slogan like that, people will can be convinced that victory will actually mean change. South Vietnam was fighting, well, I don't want to say, it's a long time since I've used that phrase. The Republic of Vietnam was going to survive. Were the promises that the reforms that went on for the Second Republic, did people have the same kind of confidence that things would get remarkably better? And there's some people who argue that those reforms, land reform, land to the tiller, people really liked them. Joseph Trulinger did extensive interviews after those reforms, and the peasants all said, it's just the same old, same old. Nothing's really going to change. It wasn't they were revolutionaries. They just didn't expect anything of the land reform program. Now, look at what happened in the North with land reform. I mean, that was something you had to bounce back from and make up for. But the point is, I think the point you're raising, there was an illusion that with peace would finally come. And at the first panel, there was this problem of this constant war, this unending war, endless war. And so how do you break the cycle psychologically, thinking, well, this time something good can come of it? And what I was talking about, as best I could, was there were very effective means of at least talking about that to people, and making it possible for them to entertain the fact that this isn't just propaganda, because I don't know any stupid Vietnamese, if you know what I'm saying. They're processing these things very carefully, and they're making calculations. And I think in the end, the totality of the war, and then the decisions the United States made, simply tipped the balance. But it didn't, the propaganda doesn't win the war or not, or how people feel doesn't win the war or not. It's what's actually happening in the strategies of all the combatants and how it implies, and that's what I was trying to get at. This idea that the political, you can't separate the political from the military, and at key moments the United States will always keep talking about, well, that was just a political victory. And that's not clear thinking. Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to add another point. So I did find the fact that many Northerners, and I mean the research also has shown that many Northerners were opposed to the war, right? And then as my research shows, the upper classes in the colonial society were pushed to the bottom in the North Vietnam after the communist government took over. So they had a lot of resentment, and many of them actually secretly hoped for the South to win the war. But of course, there's no way to find that or verify that. But then many Southerners who went to the North after the war were told that, oh, we were hoping that you would win, you guys would win. But it turned out to be another illusion, maybe.
Is there any more questions? I think we just have a couple more minutes left, so I think we can just wrap it up there and thank our three presenters one more time.